On the 20th of June 1837, King William IV of the United Kingdom died at Windsor Castle. His death was the end of an era. Since 1760, Britain's royal establishment had been dominated by King George III and his sons. Now the crown would pass to a new generation. The heir was an 18-year-old girl by the name of Victoria, a granddaughter of old King George and daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. It was the first time in nearly a full century and a quarter that Britain would have a female monarch. Observers would have speculated at the time, based on her relative youth, that Victoria would rule for a long time. But they cannot have predicted that, based on the medical advances that were being made in the 19th century and her own longevity, that Victoria would rule for the rest of the 19th century. Her name would become a byword for the era in which the British Empire peaked as the world's preeminent superpower, its power stretching from New Zealand to British Columbia. What is often strangely ignored in studies of the Victorian era is Victoria herself. Who was this woman? What did she make of her own place in the world, and was she comfortable with being the personification of Britain at a time when its power was felt globally? This is the story of Queen Victoria, the woman on whose empire the sun never set. The woman known to history as Queen Victoria was born on the 24th of May 1819 at Kensington Palace in London. Her mother was Princess Victoria Marie-Louise of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, from the royal house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in modern east-central Germany, the daughter of a duke and a countess. She had been married to Charles, Prince of Leiningen, a small state in modern Bavaria in southern Germany, and from her husband's death in 1814, she served as regent for her young son from her first marriage, Karl. In 1818, Princess Victoria gave up the regency to marry again, this time to Prince Edward of Britain. Victoria's father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, fourth son of King George III. Edward was from the House of Hanover, a royal line which originated from northern Germany, and his father was king of both Britain and Hanover, although George III never visited Hanover and spoke English as his first language. When they married in 1818, Princess Victoria became Duchess of Kent, and together they had one child, Victoria. Her father died of pneumonia in 1820, only 8 months after the birth of his only child. Victoria's mother had given birth to the future queen at 4:14 a.m. in the dining room of Kensington Palace, a strange decision that was actually based on rational thinking, as hot water could be easily brought up from the kitchen. She was also unusually delivered by a female doctor, Charlotte Heidenreich von Siebold, who coincidentally also delivered her future husband, Prince Albert. At the time of her birth, Victoria was fifth in line to the British crown. She was privately christened by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Manners Sutton, on the 24th of June 1819 in the Cupola Room at Kensington Palace. She was baptized as Alexandrina Victoria. Alexandrina after one of her godparents, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Victoria after her mother, while her royal title was Her Royal Highness Princess Victoria of Kent. She was described as a studious, thoughtful, and quietly serious child, qualities which would stand her in good stead when she became queen in 1837. The House of Hanover, to which Victoria belonged, had ruled Britain since 1714. The first two Hanoverian monarchs, George I and George II, ruled as King of Great Britain and Ireland, in addition to the separate title of King of Hanover, but Victoria's grandfather, George III, was the first to rule the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland after the official union of the two kingdoms on the 1st of January 1801. The Hanoverians, like their predecessors since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, were constitutional monarchs, which meant they had limited power, with lawmaking in the hands of the elected House of Commons and House of Lords. Hanoverian Britain was a political anomaly in Europe where absolute monarchies reigned. Victoria's grandfather, George III, had overseen moments of huge transformation both for Britain and the world. Under George III, the British Empire began a rapid expansion that would reach its peak under Victoria, though many of Britain's North American colonies were lost when the United States of America gained its freedom after victory in the American War of Independence. Conflict on European shores reduced after multiple wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France led to the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. The Hanoverian era saw industrialization and immense social change transform Britain and the world. Innovators like the engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, inventor of the first computer Charles Babbage, and inventor of the telephone Alexander Graham Bell belonged to this period. The fires of the Industrial Revolution were kept lit by the work of Brunel in particular, as through the start of the 19th century, Brunel built the roads, railways, and the first all-iron steamship, the SS Great Britain, that connected Britain's industry and commercial networks. Before Victoria came to the throne in 1837, goods and people moved around Britain by stagecoach at an average speed of 12 kilometers per hour. During her reign, the building of the railways increased this to 30 kilometers per hour by the 1830s and to 80 kilometers per hour by the 1850s. Raw materials came to Britain on steamships, feeding the hungry cotton mills of the north and bringing new goods and exotic foods to the British market. The face of Britain was changing as agriculture and imports supported a huge growth in the population from 11 million at the start of the 19th century to 37 million by the end of Victoria's reign in 1901. This growing population became increasingly urbanized, living in the growing industrial towns and working in the factories, mills and mines that powered the Industrial Revolution. By the end of the Victorian era, the towns, streets and factories of Britain were thriving and uniform in appearance due to the cheap importing of building materials. Town planning had to adapt to the swell of urban dwellers, and by 1900, pavements and street lighting improved many towns, and most new-build homes had electricity, running water, drainage, indoor lavatories, and gas for cooking. With the rise of industrial progress came demands for social change. Trade unions became the voice of the exploited workers, and campaigners began to call for political reform. Although women could still not vote, several political reforms were passed during Victoria's reign which opened up politics. Secret voting was introduced in 1872 to prevent voter intimidation, and laws were passed to prevent the bribing of voters in 1883. But MPs were still not paid until 1911, meaning that working men could not get elected to Parliament without financial support from donors or trade unions. Education improved when, in the 1870s, the government took responsibility for educating children aged 5 to 10, and by 1900, 90% of children regularly attended school, although children in rural areas were often pulled out of school to help with the harvest. Religion was also a major topic of debate in Parliament at this time, in particular about laws controlling what people could do on Sundays. New churches continued to be built, and not just ones belonging to the Church of England. Catholic churches were also built in this period as religious toleration was on the rise. But underneath the progress, innovation and prosperity, The Britain of Victoria and her Hanoverian predecessors was a place of harsh poverty laws, rife crime, and over-punitive punishment, pollution, prostitution, slums, and begging. Victoria herself was deeply socially conservative and believed that people should not move out of the social class into which they were born. Victoria even opposed women being given the vote, describing the idea as a mad and wicked folly. It was during Victoria's reign that the British Navy ruled the seas and the British Empire reached its peak. The Victorian age was to be remembered as a golden era for Britain. At the time of Victoria's birth, it seemed unlikely that she would become queen at all. She was only fifth in line for the throne, but by the time she turned 18, she had become the heir to the throne due to the quick succession of deaths of her relatives. When Victoria was born, her uncle George, Prince of Wales, was acting as regent while King George III was suffering from a debilitating mental illness, which grew worse towards the end of his reign. Her uncle ruled as regent for 9 years and finally ascended the throne in 1820, becoming King George IV. Even after the death of the incapacitated George III, the problems for the British monarchy were far from over. George IV married the Catholic widow Maria Anne Fitzherbert in 1785 in a secret and illegal ceremony. Any children they produced would not be viewed as legitimate, and so George was finally persuaded to marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. This second marriage, though legal and approved by the elites and public alike, did not have a happy ending. The couple had one child, a daughter, Princess Charlotte, together before separating, causing a public scandal. George IV had already proved unpopular due to his spoiled nature, greed, and dissolute behavior. Then, in 1817, George IV's only daughter, Princess Charlotte, died while giving birth to a stillborn son. 2 generations of heirs had vanished, and a desperate race to produce a legitimate heir began between the king's unmarried brothers. The second oldest brother, Frederick, Duke of York, had already married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia, but the couple had no children, and Frederick died in 1827. The third brother, William, Duke of Clarence, later King William IV, abandoned his long-term mistress and married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. After Frederick's death, William was next in line to the throne, and any legitimate children he had would become his heirs, ahead of his younger brother Edward, the fourth son, but William had no legitimate children. Victoria's father, Edward, Duke of Kent, was the fourth son of George III, and he quickly married Victoria's mother, Princess Victoria, in 1818 in order to continue the line of succession. The widowed Victoria already had 2 children from a previous marriage. Her daughter, Princess Feodor, would become Victoria's beloved half-sister and companion. Upon her birth, Victoria took her place in the order of succession behind her uncle William IV, any of his surviving children, and her own father. At 8 months old, Victoria's world was overturned when her father died suddenly in January 1820. The family were left with large debts and found themselves under the controlling hand of Sir John Conroy, Edward's equerry, and an ex-officer in the Royal Household Artillery, who claimed that Victoria's father had asked him to take care of his widowed wife and child. When she turned 4, Victoria began her education under the tutoring of Reverend George Davies. Her new tutor was said to be patient and polite and encouraged her to develop her talents. She completed her lessons according to a strict timetable and was particularly good at languages, learning to speak French, German, Italian, and Latin, as well as the English which she used at home. She also benefited from the guidance of a singing teacher, the opera singer Luigi Lablache, and drawing lessons from esteemed painter Richard Westall. A rigorous education was not the only hardship in Victoria's childhood. Her childhood was strictly regimented by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and John Conroy. Her mother increasingly depended on the controlling Conroy, partly because of the limitations of her English. Conroy was highly ambitious and exerted his influence over the Duchess and Victoria with the intention of controlling the throne, a tactic that would have been especially effective if Victoria were to ascend the throne under the age of 18 and so require her mother to act as regent. The Regency Act of 1830 had made provision for Victoria's mother to rule as regent if King William IV died before Victoria reached majority age, a decision which displeased William as he distrusted the Duchess. Conroy set about attempting to increase the popularity of the Duchess, who was unpopular amongst the wider royal family. Strict rules were established to govern the royal household and Victoria in particular, rules which became known as the Kensington system. As a result of these rules, Victoria grew up in isolation and naivety. All forms of independence were frowned upon, and she was constantly supervised. She wasn't allowed her own bedroom and had to sleep on a small bed in her mother's room. She was not even permitted to walk down the stairs without holding someone's hand in case she fell. Victoria later described her childhood at Kensington Palace as isolating and demoralizing. Given this isolation, the child Victoria had very few friends and was left to entertain herself. Some of Victoria's favourite childhood hobbies included drawing, writing stories, and making costumes for her collection of dolls with her beloved governess, Baroness Lesen. She also kept a diary and wrote over 60 million words across her lifetime. She spent hours playing on her own or with her little dog, the King Charles Spaniel Dash, and even had trousers made for him. She referred to this time as one of the loneliest of her life and had only her equally loved governess and her dog for company. Although Victoria grew to resent her isolation and the rules created by Conroy, they did in some ways work in her favour. Her mother and Conroy's determination to keep her weak and dependent on them by keeping her away from people they thought undesirable, including her father's family and especially King William IV, who had several illegitimate children, had backfired. Her absence from court ensured she wasn't associated with her unpopular uncles and predecessors, George IV and William IV. Equally, archival research by the Historic Royal Palace's curators has suggested that Victoria's later recollection of her unhappy childhood was misremembered. There is plenty of evidence that her mother loved her deeply and spoiled Victoria. She was surrounded by her beloved governess and supportive tutors. She even enjoyed trips to the coast, the theatre, and the ballet, which she loved the most. She also went on several royal tours around the country between 1830 and 1835. An avid writer, she recorded these excursions and noted down her impressions of the country. She wrote of her shock after seeing the Black Country in the West Midlands, so named because of the smog caused by iron-making and coal mining, on one of her earliest trips. The country is very desolate, everywhere smoking and burning coal heaps intermingled with wretched huts and carts and little ragged children. To William IV's annoyance, Victoria was greeted warmly by crowds of people at every point of her journeys. William disliked the way that these tours seemed to present Victoria as his rival rather than his heir, and compared them to royal progresses, a medieval royal tour in which the king would be greeted at every town he stopped in with formal ceremonies and festivals. Victoria, too, disliked these tours, partly because of their exhausting nature and partly because of William's disapproval, but her mother forced her to continue with them. In 1835, Conroy made his biggest attempt to solidify his control over the future queen. During another tour, Victoria contracted a severe fever while at Ramsgate, a seaside town in southeast England, and Conroy and her mother took advantage of her state to badger her into making Conroy her private secretary. But Victoria resisted, as she had during all of Conroy's previous attempts to get himself an official position on her staff. As her uncle the king finally approached the end of his life, Victoria was viewed as the nation's hope. She emerged from her isolation and from the strict rules of her mother and Conroy as a bright new prospect, a new start for the monarchy. On the 20th of June 1837, Victoria was awoken early at 6 a.m. to receive some unexpected visitors at Kensington Palace who were bearing important news. She went downstairs and, unusually, saw these visitors alone, and while still wearing her dressing gown. Chief among her visitors was Lord Cunningham, the Lord Chamberlain, the most senior officer of the royal household, who told her that her uncle, the king, had died at 2:12 a.m. Victoria was now queen, and at age 18, she was old enough to rule alone. One of the first actions that Victoria took was having her bed removed from her mother's bedroom. This was not the only step she took to break free from the influence of her mother and Conroy. That day, the day of her accession, Victoria dressed in mourning black to honour her uncle and made her first public appearance as queen alone, stepping confidently out of her mother's shadow. Her first official appearance was a success. 97 councillors, cabinet ministers and officials arrived in the Red Saloon at Kensington Palace for their first meeting with the new queen. The Duke of Wellington later described this gathering of the Accession Council and noted that, despite the new queen's petite size, Victoria was only 5'1", she had not only filled her chair, she filled the room. Flushed with the success of her first appearance, Victoria set about asserting her influence and crafting a new life for herself. She fled the confinement of the Kensington system and left Kensington Palace itself for Buckingham Palace, which became her main residence. She dismissed Conroy and kept her mother at arm's length by installing her in a distant apartment in Buckingham Palace and later in a house in Belgrave Square. Her governess, Baroness Leeson, was invited to live in Buckingham Palace as Victoria's companion. It was around this time that Victoria dropped her first name, Alexandrina, and went solely by Victoria. Despite her outward confidence, Victoria did admit to feeling nervous on her coronation day. Held on the 28th of June 1838, the coronation drew thousands of people out onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the young new queen. Victoria later wrote in her diary that the sight of the cheering and waving crowd from her carriage calmed her nerves. How proud I felt to be queen of such a nation. The coronation itself did not run smoothly. The bishop fumbled his lines and called the ceremony to an end too early. An elderly peer had a fall, and the coronation ring was placed onto the incorrect finger. But the elated public would not remember these mishaps, as they enjoyed fireworks and a fair at Hyde Park, as well as free access to the theatres across London. As with many important moments in Victoria's reign, care was taken to allow the public a glimpse of the monarch and a chance to celebrate the monarchy. Unlike her coronation, the first year of Victoria's reign passed without any serious missteps. Her youth and distance from her unpopular predecessors encouraged a rose-tinted view of her reign. Many people looked forward to a new and hopeful era under her rule. Her petite size, youth, inexperience, and gender resulted in people underestimating her. Her gender had barred her from taking up the throne of Hanover upon which her predecessors had sat, because ancient Salic law excluded women from Hanoverian succession. Instead, her father's unpopular younger brother, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became King of Hanover, as well as Victoria's heir, until she had a child. But Victoria was determined to succeed as monarch of Britain, writing in her diary, I shall do my utmost to fulfill my duty towards my country. I am very young and perhaps in many, although not all things, inexperienced. But I am sure that very few have more real goodwill and more real desire to do what is fit and right than I have. Her rosy first year was followed by a harder second one, partly as a result of her overdependence on her favourite ministers and advisers, particularly Prime Minister Lord Melbourne of the Whig Party and King Leopold of Belgium. Victoria's reliance on Melbourne and their close relationship caused rumours to spread that the new Queen was under the Prime Minister's influence, and even, despite a large age gap of 40 years, that they were having a secret romantic relationship, a rumour that has never been proven. It seems more likely that the inexperienced Victoria relied on Melbourne for advice and looked up to him as a father figure. Given that Melbourne was widowed and childless, many, including aristocrat and diarist Charles Greville, noted that he was passionately fond of her as he might be of his daughter if he had one. In the year 1839, two political scandals threatened to tarnish Victoria's reputation. The first was a court intrigue involving Lady Flora Hastings, a lady-in-waiting to Victoria's mother, who, it was rumoured, was expecting an illegitimate child with Conroy. An abdominal growth, later proved in a post-mortem to be a large tumour on the liver, fuelled these rumours. Victoria, who harboured deep resentment against Conroy and her mother for her restricted childhood, believed the rumours and demanded evidence. Lady Flora initially refused to submit to an intimate medical examination, only acquiescing to an examination in February, which proved that she was a virgin. The Hastings family, Conroy and the opposing Tories turned the press against the Queen, claiming that she had spread false rumours about Lady Flora and Victoria was hissed at during public appearances. To make matters worse, another political scandal quickly succeeded the first, the bedchamber crisis of 1839. Lord Melbourne had resigned as Prime Minister after the Liberal Radicals and Tories voted against a bill to suspend the Constitution of Jamaica. The bill passed by a narrow majority and removed political power from the plantation owners who had resisted the abolition of slavery. A Tory government was to be formed under Robert Peel, but Victoria's refusal to allow Peel to appoint her ladies of the bedchamber, as was the political custom, caused a political crisis when Peel refused to govern under the restrictions Victoria had imposed. Melbourne returned to office, and many questioned Victoria's ability to rule as a constitutional monarch, a figure who should sit above and apart from the politics of Parliament. When support for Melbourne in the House of Commons finally dried up in 1841, the ladies of the bedchamber most associated with the Whigs were replaced as Peel became Prime Minister during the 1841 general election. Just as the dominance of her mother and Conroy had waned, Lord Melbourne's influence over Victoria was also to come to an end. Her next confidant and chief political advisor was to have the greatest impact on her life and reign. Her husband, German Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Victoria and Prince Albert had first met in May 1836. Albert, who was also Victoria's cousin, was invited to visit Kensington Palace by Victoria's mother and under the encouragement of his uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. A union between them had been planned by their families almost from birth, despite King William IV's disapproval. He had wanted to avoid another Coburg royal match and preferred Prince Alexander of the Netherlands as a suitor. Victoria and Albert had already become friends during Albert's visit in 1836, but it wasn't until 1839 that Victoria decided she was ready for marriage. On the 23rd of November 1839, Victoria summoned the Privy Council to Buckingham Palace to declare her intention to marry Albert. She had carefully evaluated the parade of eligible princes which had been sent her way, and concluded that Albert was extremely handsome, with a most delightful countenance. She had already written to Albert's uncle, King Leopold, at the age of 17, before she was ready for marriage, thanking him for the prospect of great happiness you have contributed to give me in the person of dear Albert. He possesses every quality that could be desired to render me perfectly happy. Victoria's decision to marry Albert was complex. As queen, love could not be the only motivator for marriage. Though Victoria did love Albert, she decided to marry partly because she needed support with her royal responsibilities and partly to win public approval. When, on the 15th of October 1839, she proposed to Albert, as royal protocol demanded, Victoria gushed at his acceptance. The couple embraced, and Victoria later wrote joyfully in her diary, "Oh, how I adore and love him, I cannot say." Victoria and Albert's wedding on the 10th of February 1840 was a public affair. It was the first royal wedding which had been planned with public enjoyment in mind. The people of London enjoyed a view of Queen Victoria in an open carriage ride on her way to the ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a fashionable white satin court dress instead of royal robes, appearing as the woman she was as well as a queen. The style has been copied by brides since. She also wore an orange blossom wreath over her veil, a brooch made by Albert, and earrings and a necklace made of Turkish diamonds. Prince Albert wore the uniform of a British field marshal. Photographs were taken of the happy couple in their wedding clothes and were shared widely. Victoria's wedding, the white dress, carriage ride through the streets, the cheering crowds, set the pattern for all future royal weddings involving the main line of descent of the royal family. A fanfare of trumpets announced the bride's procession. Lord Melbourne headed the procession, with the Queen following on the arm of her uncle, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, who took the place of her late father. Victoria revelled in her marriage. It became a true love match. She wrote in her diary that her wedding day had been the happiest day of my life. The couple enjoyed a short but sweet honeymoon and proceeded happily into married life together. Despite Victoria's status as queen, both Albert and Victoria were traditionalists. They both believed that the man should be the dominant one in any marriage, yet Albert proved to be a devoted husband, and Victoria's first pregnancy in 1840 helped to ease the situation. As her pregnancy progressed, Albert supported her, reading her the daily dispatches from the government when she wasn't well enough to get up. They worked closely together on side-by-side desks at Buckingham Palace, and Albert gradually became, in effect, Victoria's private secretary, taking on more of her responsibilities as she approached the end of her pregnancy and began increasingly devoting herself to motherhood and her family. Albert had encouraged Victoria to work towards improving her relationship with her mother, and it was while the pregnant Victoria and Albert were en route to visit the Duchess that 18-year-old Edward Oxford attempted to assassinate her as she passed in her carriage. Oxford's gun was fired twice, but either the bullets missed or, as he later claimed, the gun was not loaded. He was tried for high treason, found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, was committed to an insane asylum and later deported to Australia. In the aftermath of the attack, Victoria's popularity rose, and the Hastings affair and bedchamber crisis were forgotten. But this assassination attempt and the acquittal of Oxford encouraged further attacks, including in 1842, 1849, 1850, 1872, and 1882. Later in life, Victoria showed great bravery when, After dodging an assassination attempt while out riding along the Mall in London on the 29th of May 1842, she agreed to ride out again on the following day so that John Francis, the would-be assassin, could be lured out and caught in the act by plain-clothed policemen. But Victoria's popularity among her subjects was most rooted in her motherhood and the perfect image of the royal family she created. Victoria and Albert were devoted parents and were thrilled by the arrival of their first child, Princess Victoria, or Vicky. Their family quickly grew despite the difficulties Victoria experienced during pregnancy. Their first child, Vicky, was followed by Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Victoria suffered postnatal depression after many of her pregnancies and vehemently disliked breastfeeding. By the time of her 8th and 9th pregnancies, she promoted the use of chloroform as pain relief, despite the protestations of the clergy, who saw it as against biblical teachings, and some members of the medical profession who thought it was dangerous. The royal couple shared a great interest in their children and took great pleasure in raising and educating them. They presented an image of a happy family to the world, sharing their joy on holidays and birthdays with the public through the new illustrated newspapers. Albert took an active role in parenting, spending lots of time playing with his children, unlike many aristocratic fathers at the time. Victoria happily described her husband's wonderful relationship with their children in her diary. He is so kind to them and romps with them delightfully. Albert crafted joyful scenes of domestic Christmases, popularizing festive traditions, such as decorating a Christmas tree, which have survived into present-day British homes. The image of the happy domestic royal family added to Victoria's popularity. She became a symbol of marital harmony and domestic bliss, widely known to be driven by strong moral convictions, which made her very popular with the rising middle classes. Her financial prudence meant that she successfully cleared her father's debts, and she ran a relatively simple home, for a royal, in sharp contrast to the excesses of her predecessors. Victoria recognized that public opinion rose when she openly devoted herself to her children, and letting Albert take over some of her royal duties proved to be a wise decision. Upon their marriage, Albert had been granted the formal title of HRH Prince Albert, but had been popularly known as HRH Prince Consort, a title which Victoria formalized on the 29th of June 1857. The effective working partnership between Victoria and Albert was summed up by Charles Greville in 1845 when he wrote, "They are one person, and he likes and she dislikes business." Albert aimed to create a new, powerful role as Prince Consort. Recognizing a rival in influence over his wife, Albert persuaded Victoria to send her confidant, Baroness Lesen, back to Germany for a quiet retirement. After the death of Prime Minister Melbourne in 1842, Victoria became entirely dependent on Albert. Albert's wise guidance and connections proved invaluable to Victoria, but she still took ownership over decisions which were important to her. As the Great Famine tore through Ireland, killing over 1 million people and displacing another million, Victoria was denounced as the Famine Queen in Ireland. In January 1847, she donated £2,000 of her personal money to the British Relief Association, an amount worth several million in today's money, the greatest donation made by any individual. She supported the repeal of the Corn Laws, which were keeping the price of grain artificially high and fueling the devastating impact of the famine for Irish people. She boldly ignored Protestant opposition to support the increase of an annual grant from the British government to St Patrick's College, Maynooth, a dilapidated Catholic seminary in Ireland. Later rumours of Victoria's cold indifference to the plight of the Irish and the story that she had only donated £5 to the relief and had given the same amount to Battersea Dogs Home on the same day, were fabricated. Victoria's first visit to Ireland in 1849, when the famine was almost at an end, was a success, though it had no lasting impact on the growth of Irish nationalism. Victoria and Albert both took a keen interest in Europe and especially in improving foreign relations between Britain and France. Victoria became the first British monarch to visit a French monarch since King Henry VIII had visited King Francis I of France in 1520. Through Albert, Victoria was related to the House of Orléans via the Coburgs and visited King Louis-Philippe I in Normandy twice, in 1843 and 1845. When Louis-Philippe returned the visit in 1844, he became the first French king to visit a British sovereign, and when he was deposed during the revolutions of 1848, he sought exile in England. Demonstrations in England by the Chartists and Irish nationalists failed to attract the widespread support that revolutionary movements were seeing on the European continent. Albert was also responsible for the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was designed as a public celebration of technological innovation and the growth of trade. Albert was very intelligent and highly interested in trade, industry, art and science. The Great Exhibition featured over 100,000 exhibits from across the world and even displayed the famous Koh-i-Noor diamond from India. As Albert was socially conscious, perhaps more so than his wife, the Great Exhibition was fairly priced to allow anyone to visit. The top price season ticket of 3 guineas was equivalent to over £2,000 in today's money, but there were also cheap day tickets available at the reasonable price of 1 shilling. Over 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. It gave many people their first taste of the wider world and was widely lauded as a huge success. Victoria herself was so enthralled by her husband's project that she visited the exhibition almost every day for 3 months. The Great Exhibition also had foreign admirers. Napoleon III of France invited Victoria and Albert to the Exposition Universelle in August 1855 after visiting the royal couple in London earlier that year. They were also guests of honour at an extravagant ball at the Palace of Versailles and visited the tomb of Napoleon I on their trip. Victoria and Albert also sought to bolster relations with Albert's German homeland. In 1858, Albert's favourite child, Vicky, their firstborn, was married at age 17 to Prince Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, the future Kaiser of Germany, on the 25th of January 1858 at the Royal Chapel of St James's Palace in London. Albert hoped that the liberal education he had given his daughter would help her steer Prussia and later the German Empire into a liberal constitutional monarchy based on the British model. But he hugely miscalculated, overestimating the strength of the very small middle class in Prussia and underestimating the popularity of conservatism. Vicky was not to have the happy life which her father had when he married into a foreign royal family. Vicky was criticised for her overly British views on monarchy and her English origins. She was ostracised by the royal house of the Hohenzollerns, the conservatives at the Berlin court, and her rising political opponent Otto von Bismarck. As tensions deepened between her childhood nation and the nation of her marriage, Vicky became very unpopular and suffered. Through the fortuitous marriages of their 9 children, Victoria and Albert successfully made connections to foreign royal families across the European continent. Many of the thrones of Europe belonged to, or were closely related to, Victoria's 9 children and her 42 grandchildren. Of the 8 grandchildren which their eldest child Vicky gave them, Sophie went on to marry a Greek prince, becoming Queen of Greece. The marriage of their second child, Prince Albert, to Princess Alexandra of Denmark resulted in connections with Denmark and, when their own child Maud married the king to Norway. Several connections were formed with the German states, including through the marriage of their third child, Princess Alice, to Grand Duke Louis IV of the German state of Hesse. Their daughter, Alix, went on to marry the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. Connections with Russia had already been formed when Victoria's fourth child, Prince Alfred, was married to the Grand Duchess Marie, daughter of Tsar Alexander II. Their fifth child, Princess Helena, married Prince Frederick Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, further solidifying relations with the German states. However, their sixth child, Princess Louise, broke the mould by marrying a commoner, John Douglas Sutherland Campbell, who became the Duke of Argyll, a prominent MP and Governor-General of Canada. This unique marriage actually had the support of Victoria, British Prime Minister Disraeli, and the general public, as many feared yet another German marriage. Prince Arthur, child number 7 and a military enthusiast, he had risen to the rank of Field Marshal, married Princess Louise Marguerite of Prussia. Their eighth child and youngest boy, Prince Leopold, married Princess Helena Frederica of Waldeck and Pyrmont, another German state, although he died 2 years after this happy union was formed due to haemophilia, a genetic condition which spread through Victoria's network of descendants across Europe, a condition which particularly harmed the Russian royal family when the sole heir to the throne, Alexei, the son of Victoria's granddaughter Alix and Tsar Nicholas, was found to harbour the often deadly disease. As Victoria's husband Albert had died when their ninth and last child, Princess Beatrice, was 4 years old, Victoria rejected any potential suitors and kept her close as a companion. At the age of 27, Beatrice finally met her love match, Prince Henry of Battenberg, at a family wedding, and although Victoria remained opposed to the match for 8 months, the couple eventually wore her down and they married with her blessing under the condition that they live in Britain. Their daughter, Victoria, would marry into the Spanish royal family, introducing the haemophilic gene into another European dynasty. On the whole, Victoria and Albert had succeeded in their aim of building connections across Europe with the marriages of their 9 children and 42 grandchildren, but their goal of Europe-wide peace failed enormously as the First World War broke out, even with 3 cousins on the rival thrones of Britain, Russia, and Germany. Victoria's life and her happy family were blown apart in 1861 when her mother died. Although they had not had a perfect relationship, Victoria felt huge grief when she discovered in her mother's papers that she had, in fact, deeply loved her daughter. Worse tragedy followed when the person she depended on most for support and strength, her husband Albert, also died. Albert fell ill of typhoid fever and died on the 14th of December 1861 at the young age of 42. Victoria was heartbroken and never moved beyond her grief. She wrote to her uncle Leopold that, "My life as a happy one is ended. The world is gone for me." Her royal duties and the carefully honed image of the royal domestic family came under threat. During a Privy Council meeting 3 weeks after Albert's death, Victoria was so full of grief that she couldn't speak. Consumed by deep grief, Victoria wore mourning black and minimal jewellery for the rest of her life and withdrew from public gaze, which was disastrous for her public image. Her depression caused her to put on weight, which further discouraged her from making public appearances. She became very lonely and overcompensated by dominating her children's time and obsessively keeping the memory of their father alive. Victoria's seclusion led people to assume that she was incapable of doing her job. She lost her confidence and avoided public appearances other than her official government duties, retreating behind the walls of her favourite royal residences, Balmoral in Scotland, Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and Windsor Castle. The public began to lose respect for the Queen, and some even began to call for the abolition of the monarchy. Doctors who came to see Victoria feared that she was mentally ill. She remained in self-imposed seclusion until the early 1880s, when her family, in particular her uncle Leopold, confidants and Prime Minister Disraeli, finally convinced her to appear more in public. Under their encouragement, she agreed to visit the gardens of the Royal Horticultural Society at Kensington and to take a drive through London in an open carriage. But it was really two men, John Brown and Abdul Karim, who succeeded in pulling Victoria out of her grief enough to fully repair her image and become involved in the political sphere once more. John Brown, a plain-speaking Highlander and Victoria's manservant, became one of her favourites in 1861. Victoria described his constant presence as a real comfort, but not everyone approved of his influence over the Queen. The press suggested the two were secretly married, and Brown became very unpopular within the royal household, a fact which did not dissuade Victoria in the slightest. Brown helped Victoria deal with her deep grief and treated her as a woman rather than a queen. In 1866, Victoria stepped back into the political sphere, attending the state opening of Parliament for the first time since Albert's death, and openly supporting the Reform Act of 1867, which extended voting rights to many urban working men. The second of Victoria's confidants was even more unpopular with the court than John Brown. Abdul Karim was Victoria's personal servant and munshi, or teacher, from India from 1887 to the end of her life. Karim perhaps attracted more prejudice and jealousy than Brown due to ideas of racial superiority which were widespread at the time, and because he was from a low social background. But, as with Brown, Victoria did not listen to the advice and jealous mutterings of others. Karim taught Victoria the Urdu language, which she became fluent in, and about Indian culture, which fascinated her. Victoria's notes from her lessons still survive, along with many of her other writings. The Queen became increasingly interested in the British Empire in the latter part of her reign, and devoted much time and energy to promoting the expansion and glorification of the empire. By the end of Victoria's reign, the British Empire covered more than a fifth of the world's landmass and included nearly 1 in 4 people, including the entire Indian subcontinent, as well as large parts of Africa and several Caribbean islands. Between 1815 and 1914, approximately 400 million people and 10 million square miles were added to the empire, the majority of which occurred during Victoria's long reign. The wars of Victoria's era were often ones fought on distant shores, an exception being the Crimean War, which was fought against Russia in 1854 to 1856. It was during this war that the first Victoria Cross was awarded. It was the first official honour granted to ordinary servicemen for bravery. The British Army and Royal Navy were involved in conflicts in Afghanistan, China, India, Ghana against the Ashanti people, in eastern southern Africa against the Zulus, Egypt, and in South Africa against the Boers. Victoria was not naive about the cost of empire. She was very much in favour of expansionism and the empire, and deeply approved of Prime Minister Disraeli's expansionist foreign policy. If we are to maintain our position as a first-rate power, we must be prepared for attacks and wars somewhere or other. She saw the expansion of the British Empire as necessary for civilization and for protecting native people from aggressive rulers. On the 1st of May 1876, Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a title bestowed on her by parliamentary vote, although she had been both interested and involved in the ruling of India long before then. In the 1840s, she had registered her disgust at the behaviour of the East India Company, a semi-private corporation that ran the British territories in India and profited hugely from trade in the region. In 1856, she wrote, "I always feel sorry for those poor deposed Indian princes." Victoria had actually met one of the men deposed by the British, Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire, who had been deposed by the British in 1848 and was invited to meet Victoria and Albert in 1854 after he had converted to Christianity. Despite an attempt to return to Lahore and take back the throne in later life, he was reconciled with Victoria in 1890 when she gave him a full pardon. Victoria would become the godmother to Singh's daughter, Princess Sophia Alexandrovna Duleep Singh, who became a prominent English suffragette and campaigned for women's rights outside Hampton Court Palace, where Victoria had allowed her family to live. Despite her interest in India, her mastery of the Urdu language, and her friendship with Abdul Karim, Victoria never visited India. As well as her investiture as Empress of India, Victoria's popularity was restored by the extravagant celebrations of her Golden Jubilee in 1887, marking 50 years of her rule, and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, celebrating 60 years. Her appearances in public caused great excitement, and her open smile as she processed through London on an open carriage ride on the day of her Golden Jubilee was one of very few moments when Victoria's smile was captured on camera. But Victoria did not forget her grief in private, writing on the day of her Golden Jubilee, "The day has come, and I am alone." By 1897, Victoria's popularity and her confidence were fully restored. She became seen as the nation's grandmother and received thousands of congratulatory messages for her Diamond Jubilee from across the world. She sent a telegraph message of thanks to her subjects. "From my heart, I thank my beloved people. May God bless them." The huge outpouring of national pride led to the era being known as Victorian Britain. The lack of major wars to fund during her reign, especially in comparison with the decades following her reign, and the huge new wealth generated by industry and trade resulted in a larger and more affluent middle and upper class which could afford to spend more on leisure. Town parks began to open, the first in Preston, Lancashire, and cricket, football, rugby and athletic clubs were established. Music halls, theatres, readings and comic operas became increasingly popular, and museums opened, including the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1852. For those not living in poverty, the Victorian age was truly a golden period. By 1901, at the age of 81, Victoria was becoming frail, had lost a lot of weight, and had to use a wheelchair to move around. She moved to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight for peace and to avoid the spotlight. The few people who saw her at this time said she seemed to have shrunk to half the person she had been. She suffered from osteoarthritis, a condition which made her joints painfully stiff, and her surviving dresses from this period were altered to accommodate a dowager's hump, a hump on her upper back caused by spinal collapse. The last year of Victoria's life had been hard. She had lived to see the death of her second son, Alfred, in July 1900, who had died after the suicide of his own son, the breakdown of his marriage, and excessive drinking. Her favourite grandson, Christian Victor, child of her daughter Beatrice, died in October 1900 of malaria, along with his father. The sorrow perhaps shortened Victoria's life, as her companions noted that not only her stature, but also her spirit seemed to be shrinking, and she lost her appetite. Despite being nearly blind, Victoria continued to write in her diary until her last entry on the 13th of January 1901, when her strength began to leave her. Her first grandson, Wilhelm II, the German Kaiser, rushed to her side as her death loomed, joining her son and successor Edward VII. Victoria died on the 22nd of January 1901 at the age of 81 in her grandson's arms on the Isle of Wight. She had ruled for almost 64 years, the longest reign of any British monarch up to that point. In keeping with the Queen's wishes, her body was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil and brought back to London. Her funeral procession passed through streets full of mourners on its way to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, where her funeral was held. Her eldest son, King Edward VII, walked behind her coffin, accompanied by her third son, Prince Arthur, and grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Her funeral was simple and respectful, as she had requested. Victoria was then laid to rest with her husband Albert at the Royal Mausoleum near Frogmore House in the grounds of Windsor Castle. She had asked for certain items to be buried with her, including some jewellery, plaster casts of her children's hands, and Albert's dressing gown. She had also secretly asked her trusted royal doctor to add a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair to her left hand. Above the mausoleum door were inscribed Victoria's words, "Farewell, best beloved. Here at last I shall rest with thee in Christ I shall rise again." Victoria was the last British monarch of the House of Hanover and was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on the 22nd of January 1901. Victoria never believed that she, as a woman, was the best person to be monarch. She believed, like many of her contemporaries, that men made the best leaders. But by the time of her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, no one, not even Victoria herself, could doubt that a woman was capable of being the monarch. Despite several years of unpopularity when she became a reclusive widow, Victoria was immensely popular, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. She appeared to many to be a benevolent matriarchal figure above politics. Only after her death and the release of her diaries and letters did the extent of her deep political influence become clear. Although constrained by the constitutional monarchy she represented, Victoria took advantage of her rights, that is, the right to be consulted, the right to encourage, and the right to warn. As essayist Walter Bagehot stated, and more than once she altered the direction of policies and politicians by wielding her influence. Victoria, despite her lack of confidence, had been a skilled politician who successfully presented herself as a devoted wife and mother, which home-loving Victorians idolized. Identified with strict standards of personal morality, Victoria brought stability to a monarchy which had been rocked by a series of unreliable and often unpopular kings. She had made the monarchy more accessible, for example, by opening up her birthplace, Kensington Palace, to the public in 1899, by setting the public-oriented tone of her own and future royal weddings, and through her public appearances, such as at the Great Exhibition. Victoria's reign took Britain through a tumultuous period of industrial, economic, technological, and social change. She had overseen huge expansion abroad and stability and growth at home, and her reign was remembered by the Victorians and their descendants as a golden age of British greatness. Yet, in some ways, her legacy, and the legacy of her era, has become more contentious over time. As historians evaluate the cost of industrial progress and expansion abroad, the experiences of non-British subjects of the empire and the poor in Britain are now being included in the narrative of the Victorian age. Victoria's investiture as Empress of India and her role as leader of the empire complicates her legacy. Victoria and Albert's intention to promote peace in Europe by establishing a network of alliances through royal marriages represented another failure. Although Victoria was fondly known as the grandmother of Europe and had successfully married off her 9 children and 42 grandchildren into several royal European houses, war was not avoided. By the turn of the 20th century, Victoria's grandchildren were on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece, Norway, Romania, and Spain. But her vision of a peaceful Europe was not to come to pass, as her own grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led Germany into war against Britain in 1914. Amongst her notable descendants, the three cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, and King Edward VII, have often been blamed by historians for the outbreak of the First World War. But Victoria and Albert's legacy lives on as their living descendants still sit on several European thrones. From her links to present-day monarchs to the history of the Victorian age that British children are taught at school, Victoria endures. The image of her as a stately old lady clad in her black mourning attire has defined her to this day. But a more complex image of Victoria and her era is coming to light. What do you think of Queen Victoria? Was she a passive woman dominated by powerful male advisors and far removed from the suffering of her people? Or was she a complex and intelligent ruler who did what she could within the limitations of a constitutional monarchy? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Queen Victoria's reign stretched over a period of 63.5 years. When she came to the throne, Britain was in the midst of the railway boom, and people still rode around London in carriages and lit their homes with lamps. When she died, the world had been electrified, and automobiles were about to displace horses from the streets of the world's great cities. Victoria's life changed immeasurably across the same 63-year period, and that was largely because of her husband. On the 10th of February 1840, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was given the lesser title of Prince Albert so as not to distract from her position as Queen Regnant. His early death, 21 years later in 1861, at just 42 years of age, was an event from which she never fully recovered. Victoria famously took to wearing black mourning clothes for the rest of her life and withdrew from excessive engagement with the public. What was it about Albert that inspired this severe reaction in her? After all, most royal marriages were largely arranged prior to the 20th century for political and dynastic reasons. Why did Victoria develop such an attachment to Albert? Where had he come from, and what was his life like before he moved to Britain and married the Queen? On the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria of Britain, died at 42 years of age. This German royal consort had made his mark on British history, overseeing projects like the establishment of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Victoria was deeply affected by his death. She spent nearly 40 years constantly dressed in black, the colour worn by mourning widows, and she never remarried. Who was Albert, the man who Victoria mourned so much and who influenced the cultural and political life of 19th century Britain, yet who is so frequently overlooked in accounts of Victorian Britain? This is the story of Prince Albert of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The man known to history as Prince Albert was born Franz August Karl Albert Emanuel to the ruling family of the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld on the 26th of August 1819 at Schloss Rosenau, near Coburg in central Germany. His father was Duke Ernst III of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. He was a member of the senior Ernestine branch of the House of Wettin, a German princely family whose Catholic cousins in the junior branch ruled as electors and kings of Saxony. Ernst had served in the campaigns that led to Napoleon Bonaparte's overthrow in 1814. In July 1817, he married his cousin, Princess Louisa of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg, the only child of Duke Emil August, who ruled his duchy from the city of Gotha. The couple had 2 sons, Ernst and Albert, born in 1818 and 1819. At the time of Albert's birth, the European continent was at peace following 23 years of conflict in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Before Napoleon, the German lands were part of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling imperial entity ruled by the Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. Although the Habsburgs enjoyed full sovereignty over crown lands such as Austria and Bohemia, by the late 18th century they had little political power over the rest of Germany. In 1806, following his decisive victory over an Austro-Russian coalition army at Austerlitz in December 1805, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in western Germany. As master of Germany, Napoleon consolidated the hundreds of principalities into a few dozen more coherent entities. After his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna could not undo his work and instead formed the German Confederation, a collection of some 40 states led by Austria. As a result of these changes, the surviving German dynasties became attractive prospects for European royal houses seeking marriages with princely houses. Saxe-Coburg was among the most ambitious of these families, and over the course of the 19th century, Saxe-Coburg descendants would rule in Belgium, Bulgaria, Russia, Portugal, and Britain. Dynastic ties between the Coburgs and the British royal family were first established in May 1816, when Albert's youngest uncle, Leopold, married Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of the future King George IV of the United Kingdom. Leopold was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars and was popular in London. However, before Charlotte could inherit the throne, she died from childbirth in November 1817. Her widowed husband returned to Coburg until 1831, when he accepted the crown of newly independent Belgium. Meanwhile, Charlotte's death left the Hanoverian dynasty at risk of extinction in Britain. George IV's younger brothers had been content to maintain a string of mistresses, but their niece's death led them to seek German wives to produce legitimate heirs. Even before Charlotte's demise, her youngest uncle, Edward, Duke of Kent, had his eye on Leopold's widowed sister Victoria. The couple married in 1818, and in May 1819, the Duchess of Kent gave birth to a daughter named Alexandrina Victoria, the future Queen Victoria. A few months later, Victoria's future husband, Albert, was born at Schloss Rosenau, Duke Ernst's summer residence. Victoria and Albert's fate seemed to be linked from birth. Dr. Charlotte von Siebold, a renowned midwife, assisted at the birth of both babies. Albert was baptized by Pastor Gensler, the Lutheran cleric who had presided over the Duke and Duchess of Kent's wedding ceremony the previous May. Not long after Albert's birth, his parents' marriage began to fall apart. Ernst was frequently unfaithful, and to make up for her husband's neglect, Louisa began flirting with other men, including her brother-in-law, Prince Leopold. It was subsequently rumoured that Leopold was Albert's father, though this theory has never been proved. In 1822, Louisa's father died aged 50, leaving his duchy to his younger brother Friedrich. He had been seriously wounded in the Napoleonic Wars and was not expected to live long. The potential succession of Ernst to the dukedom when Friedrich died was complicated when Louisa left Coburg in August 1824 and abandoned her family in disgust at her husband's affairs. Nevertheless, when Duke Friedrich of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg died in February 1825, Ernst inherited Gotha through Louisa and divorced her shortly thereafter. Louisa married a Prussian officer the following year, but died 5 years later in Paris. Louisa's abrupt departure was undoubtedly a traumatic event in the childhood of the 5-year-old Albert, who remained with his father, now Duke Ernst I of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. While Ernst was a poor husband, he was a cultured man and made sure that his sons were well educated. When they were 4 years old, Ernst appointed Johann Christoph Florschütz as their tutor. The boys studied a wide range of subjects including English, French, Latin, Greek, history, mathematics, and science, as well as painting, music, and dancing. The two brothers were particularly close while growing up at Rosenau. By the time they were 10 years old, Ernst and Albert were sitting through 11 hours of lessons from Herr Florschütz every day, from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. While Albert would become highly accomplished in all subject areas, he particularly enjoyed his art and history lessons. In summer 1831, Duke Ernst travelled to London to visit his sister, the Duchess of Kent. The previous year, George IV had died and had been succeeded by his brother, King William IV. While there, Ernst discussed the prospect of his son, Albert, marrying Ernst's niece, Victoria, who was now heir to the British throne. Negotiations on this proposal continued for years to come. Meanwhile, in Germany, Ernst and Albert were being prepared for royal careers at a time when European monarchs were having their powers limited by constitutions and parliaments. In summer 1832, they went to Brussels to visit their uncle Leopold, who had become the first King of the Belgians after the Belgian Revolution of 1830. In 1836, Ernst and Albert were invited back to stay in Brussels for a year. Prior to their departure, Duke Ernst appointed Baron Friedrich Georg Christian von Richmann as their governor. An old soldier who had fought with the Hanoverians under the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, Wichmann was tasked with keeping an eye on the boys. In May 1836, Leopold arranged for them to visit England for the first time. The visit had been prompted by King William IV's decision to invite Prince William of Orange and his sons, William and Alexander, to London with the intention of marrying Victoria off to a Dutch prince. Thankfully for the Coburgers, neither of the Dutch princes made much of an impression on the young Victoria. In a letter of the time, Albert described attending the celebration of Victoria's 17th birthday, during which he briefly exchanged pleasantries with the king and also met with dignitaries such as the Duke of Wellington and Sir Robert Peel, the leader of the Conservative Party or Tories. In the same letter, Albert wrote about the ball that accompanied King William's 71st birthday and the trouble he had with the British climate and food. The Coburg princes stayed at Kensington Palace, the residence of Victoria and her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Victoria found her cousins Ernst and Albert far more interesting than the Dutch princes, and she described 16-year-old Albert as handsome. She informed her uncle Leopold that she was willing to marry him, although she did not consider herself bound to do so. Back in Brussels, Albert received a crash course in contemporary European politics from his uncle. Recently married to the daughter of King Louis-Philippe of France, Leopold offered insights into the legitimist and Bonapartist factions that challenged his Orleanist father-in-law, who had been brought to power in Paris by a liberal bourgeois revolution in 1830. In Central Europe, an uprising by Polish revolutionaries seeking to restore their independence had been crushed by the Russian Empire, while the German lands were in a tug-of-war between Protestant Prussia in the north and Catholic Austria in the south. The Austrian Habsburgs were also determined to defeat Italian aspirations for unification, given Austrian control over northern Italy around Milan and Venice. Meanwhile, Spain was paralyzed by civil war between liberal and conservative factions. These revolutionary and nationalist impulses in Europe were accompanied by economic and technological change through the Industrial Revolution. After spending 10 months in Brussels, in April 1837, Albert and Ernst enrolled at the University of Bonn, where they focused their studies on law, politics, and philosophy. A few weeks into his university studies, Albert learned of William IV's death and Victoria's accession in June 1837. While King Leopold and Duke Ernst hurried to London to press Albert's suit, in the autumn the young princes went on a tour of southern Germany, the Swiss Alps, and Venice. In early 1838 they returned to Brussels, where Leopold informed Albert that Victoria was in no hurry to marry. Instead, Albert would return to university, and the question of marriage would be revisited late in 1839. Albert dutifully returned to Bonn, where he studied German constitutional law under Professor Clemens Theodor Perthes, later a member of the Prussian House of Representatives, and philosophy under Emanuel Hermann Fichte, the son of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, an influential philosopher regarded as a father of German nationalism. In accordance with Leopold and Victoria's plans, after 3 semesters at Bonn, Albert prepared to embark on a grand tour of Italy in late 1838. He had to travel without his beloved brother Ernst, who went to the Saxon capital of Dresden for military training. After a difficult journey in the depths of winter, Albert arrived at Florence in January 1839, where he viewed the famed Medici art collections at the Uffizi Gallery and the Pitti Palace. In addition to the native Italian aristocracy, Florence was home to large numbers of Bonapartist and Polish exiles, though Albert was bored by the constant round of balls and preferred to go walking in the mountains with Francis Seymour, an English officer whom Leopold had invited to come to Italy as Albert's travelling companion. After 3 months in Florence, the party moved on to Rome, where Albert marvelled at the splendour of St. Peter's Basilica and discussed the collections of the Vatican Museum with Pope Gregory XVI. Albert's appreciation for Italian art increased under the guidance of Dr. Emil Braun, the secretary of the Prussian Archaeological Institute, who was part of a small community of German cultural intellectuals in Rome. Albert journeyed on to Naples and Pompeii before returning home. He was glad to be reunited with his father and brother in Switzerland ahead of his final summer at Rosenau. In early October, Albert and his brother went to London via Brussels to reinitiate marriage negotiations with Victoria. Although Albert had received reports that Victoria remained hesitant about the prospect of marriage, Victoria fell in love with him after his arrival at Windsor in October. Within days, she asked Albert to marry her. The Queen's announcement of her engagement to her Privy Council in November divided British political opinion. While the governing Whigs were in favour, the Tory opposition was concerned about a German consort. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, had promised Victoria that Parliament would grant Albert an annual allowance of £50,000, but the Tories reduced this to £30,000. Furthermore, Albert struggled to understand the expectations of British elites, and his request to bring his own entourage from Coburg was firmly denied by Melbourne and the Queen. Instead, Albert was obliged to take on Melbourne's private secretary, George Anson, as his own private secretary. After several days of festivities in Coburg and Gotha, Albert and his father and brother left Gotha on the 28th of January and passed through Belgium on their way to England. After arriving at London in February, Albert was named Field Marshal of the British Army. Victoria and Albert were then married on the 10th of February at St James's Palace and spent a few days at Windsor before returning to London. Historians remain divided on the exact nature of their relationship. Some have portrayed their marriage as a fairy tale romance, but others argue that while Victoria was passionately in love with Albert, the latter regarded the marriage primarily as part of his duty to further his family's dynastic ambitions. In the weeks following his marriage, Albert came to recognise that the English were not expecting him to play an active role in political life, and that he would have no formal title. Nevertheless, Albert was determined to establish a political identity independent of his wife. He chose to do so in a speech on the 1st of June 1840 at Exeter Hall on the Strand, in which he urged the enforcement of the abolition of the slave trade in the Caribbean by military force if necessary. Meanwhile, Parliament passed the Regency Act to designate Albert as regent should Victoria die before the child which she was carrying by then reached their majority. On the 22nd of November, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Victoria, or Vicky, who would be Albert's favourite child. At the same time, Albert was becoming more involved in the realm's politics. During her early reign, Queen Victoria had closely identified herself with Lord Melbourne's Whigs. Albert believed that the Queen should not be so partisan, but he was appalled by the way the Tories insulted her ministers. In June 1841, the royal couple visited the University of Oxford, where Albert received an honorary doctorate in civil law from the Duke of Wellington, the university's chancellor. The old war hero had entered politics after his retirement from the army and led a Tory administration as Prime Minister in the late 1820s. When Wellington invited Albert to attend the annual Waterloo banquet the following week, the prince snubbed him on account of the abuse the Tory students hurled at the Whig ministers during the ceremony. Albert's refusal was a political misstep, and he could not avoid encountering Wellington at other royal engagements. The mistake was more apparent after the Whigs were defeated by the Conservatives in the summer general election. By the time Victoria officially sanctioned Robert Peel's cabinet in September 1841, she was 7 months into her second pregnancy, which led to the birth in November of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales and the future Edward VII, known to the family as Bertie. The new Prime Minister found himself increasingly in communication with Albert on matters that required royal attention. Sir Robert was not only impressed by the prince's political judgment, but also pleasantly surprised to discover Albert's interest in literature and art. Peel accordingly appointed Albert to chair a royal commission to redecorate the new Palace of Westminster, seat of the Houses of Parliament, which was being rebuilt after a fire in 1834 that destroyed much of the medieval palace. While Melbourne had been Victoria's political mentor, Albert turned to Peel for guidance on English constitutional conventions. The Queen also gradually began to warm to Peel. In order to cover the budget deficit he inherited, in 1842 the new Prime Minister revived the income tax that had previously been used to finance military expenditures during the Napoleonic Wars. The tax revenue enabled him to reduce tariffs on a wide range of imported goods, lowering costs for poorer families. Peel also proposed repealing the Corn Laws that protected agricultural interests, although the measure was defeated by Conservative protectionists in the House of Commons. Peel believed that his policies were essential to protect the British Constitution from the wave of radicalism that was sweeping its way across Europe in the 1840s. The Victorian elites cloaked political and economic progress with reassuring throwbacks to the High Middle Ages, casting aside the neoclassicism inspired by Greece and Rome in favour of the Gothic, which was seen as a particularly English style of art and architecture. Accordingly, the new Palace of Westminster was being rebuilt by Sir Charles Barry and the brilliant Augustus Welby Pugin in the Gothic Revival style. Construction began in 1837 and carried on for 2 decades until the completion of the famous clock tower known informally as Big Ben. By giving Albert responsibility over its decoration, Peel not only trusted the prince's artistic judgment, but kept him away from overt political matters. In many ways, the modus vivendi established between Peel, Victoria and Albert created the modern constitutional monarchy in Britain. As a means of addressing concerns that he would import German artists to decorate the British Parliament, Albert launched a competition for drawings and frescoes that was only open to British artists. After the entrance work was exhibited at Westminster Hall in 1843 and 1844, 6 of the artists were commissioned to paint a series of murals on subjects ranging from Caesar's invasion of Britain to King Charles I's raising of his standard during the English Civil War. Away from Westminster, Albert would engage the Saxon artist Ludwig Gruner as his artistic advisor and the architect of several royal projects. Gruner's first commission for Albert was the garden pavilion at Buckingham Palace, inspired by the centrepiece of the Hofgarten in Munich. The structure, which no longer survives, indicates that although Albert was settling into British political life, he continued to see the world through German eyes. As constitutional monarchs, Victoria and Albert played a prominent role on the diplomatic front with foreign visits. In 1843, shortly after the birth of their daughter Alice, the royal couple crossed the Channel to meet with King Louis-Philippe of France at the Château d'Eau in Normandy. Britain and France had recently been involved in a century-long struggle for global hegemony which ended in 1815 with the coalition victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. The old rivals had become friendlier in recent decades, and politicians on both sides of the Channel identified shared foreign policy interests. The royal visit proved a success, and the couple would be invited to the chateau again 2 years later. In November, Albert accompanied Peel on a visit to the factories in Birmingham. The industrial city was a hotbed of radical politics, and politicians in Westminster were concerned about Albert's safety since the royal couple had been targeted by assassins in London the previous year. Despite such fears, the prince was cheered in the streets and became increasingly popular among the masses. Albert's efforts to establish himself in British society prevented him from visiting his German homeland. When he did return home, it was sadly for the funeral of his father, who had died on the 29th of January 1844. Albert travelled to Coburg and stayed with his brother, now Duke Ernst II of Saxe-Coburg Gotha, where they attended a service at the city church where their father had recently been buried. While Victoria and Albert spent most of their time at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, they longed for a summer retreat outside London. The couple had stayed a few times at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, but neither was fond of the eclectic Oriental style conceived there by George IV as Prince Regent. They soon abandoned the property after Peel helped to broker the purchase of Osborne House, overlooking the northern coast of the Isle of Wight. They commissioned the architect Thomas Cubitt to demolish the old house and replace it with a grander Italianate design conceived by Albert. Albert also designed the layout of the gardens and collaborated on the interior design with Ludwig Gruner. As the royal couple oversaw this work, the country was at a political and economic crossroads as Peel attempted to abolish the Corn Laws. The debate had fundamental repercussions on British society. Advocates of repeal tended to be political and economic liberals who supported free trade and the development of industry. Many middle-class businessmen were making large fortunes from trade, which translated into growing political power. From an economic perspective, there was no question that Britain would be better off by shifting towards higher-value industrial production and importing food from abroad. Supporters of the status quo were typically large landowners with agricultural estates who wanted to keep food prices high. To worsen Peel's predicament, a few months later, news reached London that the potato crop had failed in Ireland, leaving much of the island's population with little to eat. Peel was aware of the magnitude of the problem and proposed relief efforts, but he was opposed by his cabinet. Peel resigned in response, but he was forced to stay in office after Whig leader Lord John Russell failed to form a new administration. Albert observed proceedings in the Commons Gallery in January when Peel introduced his proposals to reduce and abolish duties on a whole range of imports, including corn, prompting vociferous attacks from his own benches. After 5 months of debate, the measure passed thanks to overwhelming support from the opposition Whigs. The Tory diehards exacted their revenge on Peel by voting with the Radicals and Irish nationalists against the Irish Coercion Bill intended to keep order on the island as the famine worsened. The minority Peelite Conservatives subsequently allied with the Whigs to form the new Liberal Party. The repeal of the Corn Laws did little to improve matters for the Irish people as the potato crop failed for a second year in 1846. Lord Russell's government organised limited relief efforts that failed to prevent the death of 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. Aside from his colonialist views that were typical of the British political establishment, Albert enjoyed a reputation as a liberal and a man of learning. This prompted the Master of Trinity College to propose his candidacy as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge following the death of the Duke of Northumberland in February 1847. Albert agreed to put his name forward. The prince was officially inaugurated as Chancellor at Buckingham Palace in March. While the post of Chancellor was largely an honorary position with limited executive functions, Albert would play an active role in the university's administration. With his experience of German university education, Albert recognized that there was much room for improvement at Cambridge, whose students were destined for the law or the church, and teaching was largely restricted to mathematics and classics. In November 1847, Albert reported to Russell that the range of subjects should be expanded. While Russell was cautious about pushing forward with university reform, Cambridge began offering courses in the natural and moral sciences in 1848. Albert's patronage inspired similar reforms at Oxford. 1848 would prove to be one of the most consequential years in European history as a wave of revolutions swept across Europe. Revolutionary activity in Paris forced King Louis-Philippe to abdicate in February and flee to England. In March, Victoria gave birth to her sixth child, a daughter named Louise after Albert's mother, while Albert drafted a plan for a united Germany which he sent to the courts at Vienna, Berlin, Dresden, and Munich. In reality, he had little power to influence events in Germany, where a National Assembly in Frankfurt proposed a German empire with the King of Prussia as its emperor and all the other German sovereigns as his vassals. The proposal horrified Victoria and Albert, as it would entail the subjugation of their German cousins under Prussian rule. In the end, King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia rejected the offer of an imperial crown. The royal couple were also anxious about the security of their own crowns, as London witnessed weeks of rioting by the Chartists, who demanded universal suffrage and greater rights for the working class. Albert was sympathetic to radical causes and had agreed to become the president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes, a philanthropic organisation to provide better housing for working-class Englishmen. He had previously supported legislation in Parliament to increase the minimum age for children to work in mines and reduce working hours to 10 hours a day. Such initiatives were designed to correct the excesses of free market capitalism while avoiding the socialist ideology of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who published their Communist Manifesto in London in February 1848. For all his influence as a patron of social housing and a university reformer, Albert resented his lack of genuine political power, which was denied him by Lord John Russell and his Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. Albert saw Palmerston's encouragement of Italian, Polish, and Hungarian revolutionaries in 1848 as deeply irresponsible. Albert enjoyed greater discretion on purely royal matters, such as the development of the royal retreat at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The Deeside estate had been leased by the diplomat Sir Robert Gordon, who died in 1847 after choking on a fishbone. Gordon was the younger brother of the 4th Earl of Aberdeen, who had recently served as Peel's Foreign Secretary and was friendly with the royal couple. As one of his late brother's trustees, Aberdeen was keen to offload Balmoral and knew that Victoria and Albert were fond of Scotland after their first trip there in 1842. Albert agreed to take on the lease, and in September 1848 the royal family made their first visit to Balmoral. The couple were happy to be back on Scottish soil and enjoyed the privacy it offered. During the rare spells of good weather, Albert enjoyed hunting on the grounds. While in Scotland, they received news of an Irish uprising in the counties of Wexford and Waterford, but this did not deter them from undertaking a royal visit to Ireland in August 1849. While there, Victoria and Albert inaugurated the new Queen's University of Ireland, made up of constituent colleges in the cities of Belfast, Cork and Galway. Unlike Trinity College Dublin, which was solely reserved for Anglican Protestants, the new institution admitted Catholics. Although Albert was impressed by the learning and moderation of the Catholic clergy in Ireland, the royal couple were caught up in renewed anti-Catholic sentiment in England after Pope Pius IX authorised the creation of 12 Catholic dioceses in England. Albert considered the move an existential threat to the Church of England, and Parliament passed a bill making Catholic ecclesiastical titles illegal, though the legislation was never enforced. On the 1st of May 1850, Victoria gave birth to her 7th child and 3rd son. Since the prince was born on the 81st birthday of the Duke of Wellington, he was named Arthur after the elderly Duke, who was one of his godparents. While Victoria and Albert were seeking to situate themselves above the nation's political battles in Parliament, they continued to urge Russell to dismiss Palmerston from the Foreign Office. Palmerston's conduct had irritated a number of foreign governments, and the royal couple were particularly concerned about his stance on the Schleswig-Holstein question. The predominantly German-speaking duchies of Schleswig, Holstein and Lauenburg were ruled by the King of Denmark, but were constitutionally distinct from the Kingdom of Denmark. In 1848, the Prussian-led German Confederation declared war on Denmark. The Danes would prevail in a 3-year conflict, but Victoria and Albert worried that Palmerston's support for Denmark was antagonizing the German powers. Arguing that British foreign policy should be guided by British national interests, Palmerston defended himself from critics in a lengthy parliamentary speech in June 1850. A few days later, Robert Peel died after falling from his horse, depriving the royal couple of a trusted confidant. Meanwhile, the Queen and Albert continued to express their dissatisfaction with Palmerston's foreign policy. The Foreign Secretary temporarily survived in office, but was forced to resign in December 1851 after sending a private telegraph congratulating Prince Louis Napoleon, who had been elected President of the Second French Republic in 1848, on the coup d'etat that ultimately led to him becoming Emperor Napoleon III of France. While Albert was plotting against Palmerston, he was also working on a grand project to promote British industry. Although the Industrial Revolution was making Britain wealthy, industrialization was opposed by many people across the political spectrum, from hardline conservative grandees who resented the desecration of the English countryside to labour agitators who highlighted the exploitation of workers by the new industrial bosses. Albert embraced industrial growth, and since 1843 had been president of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. From 1845, several prominent society members began discussing plans for a national exhibition of British arts and manufactures along the lines of the Paris expositions that had been held sporadically since the early 1800s. The idea was first suggested by telegraph pioneer William Fothergill Cooke and soon received the backing of Liberal politician Charles Wentworth Dilke and Henry Cole, a civil servant credited with the invention of the postage stamp and Christmas card. By 1849, the Society announced its ambition to hold a British national exhibition in 1851 and established a committee, chaired by Cole, for the purpose. Albert recognised that the exhibition combined his interests in art and technology and agreed to be its patron in June 1849. He quickly assumed a leading role in its organisation and became president of the Royal Commission for the exhibition of 1851. The Prince believed that it should not only showcase British products, but should be an international event promoting free trade and the unity of mankind. He led the fundraising for the project and travelled throughout the country to appeal to bankers and merchants. One of the Royal Commission's most important tasks was the construction of the exhibition building. While many different sites across London were discussed, Hyde Park was the obvious choice for the venue, although the suggestion faced opposition in Parliament and in the press. In spring 1850, the Commission set up a building committee, including luminaries like the engineers Isambard Kingdon Brunel and Robert Stevenson. Since all the proposals they received were deemed unsuitable, the committee devised a squat brick structure crowned by a massive iron dome designed by Brunel. The proposal horrified Joseph Paxton, a gardener and architect known for his work on the Duke of Devonshire's landscape garden at Chatsworth House. Paxton had built a great conservatory made from standardized glass panes supported by a structure of iron and wood, and his familiarity with the construction techniques led him to draw up plans for a vast glass building 6 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral that would cost only £88,000 to build. After the building committee's design was publicly ridiculed, the Commission accepted Paxton's proposal in July with Albert's backing. The prefabricated structure, nicknamed the Crystal Palace, was completed by February 1851. English manufacturers responded eagerly to the opportunity to exhibit their wares to the world, some of which were personally commissioned by Albert. Large collections were being assembled from Persia, China, the United States and other parts of the world for what would become an iconic event in the history of the British Empire. Ahead of the exhibition's opening, there were concerns about the threat of violence against visiting dignitaries by various groups of political dissidents. Since the Queen was due to open the exhibition, the organisers planned to restrict the opening ceremony to the diplomatic corps, but the royal couple pressed for a less exclusive event. As Albert's wife opened the exhibition on the 1st of May 1851, the Queen was awestruck by the magnificence of the Crystal Palace and its interior decoration. She accompanied Albert past an audience of 24,000 onlookers without any issue. Victoria would return to the exhibition over 30 times, and the event attracted over 6 million visitors in the 5.5 months between May and October 1851. For all of Albert's idealistic notions of universal peace and prosperity, the event was also a statement of British imperial power, as one of its most popular exhibits was the Koh-i-Noor diamond seized from the 11-year-old Maharaja Dulip Singh in 1849 and presented to the Queen in 1850. The exhibition's ticket sales generated a profit of £186,000, which Albert used to finance the construction of a cultural complex to the south of Hyde Park, nicknamed Albertopolis. The Prince personally inspected the ground where building work was to take place and offered advice on the interior decoration of the South Kensington Museum, which opened in June 1857 and was later rebuilt as the Victoria and Albert Museum. To consolidate his legacy as a patron of the arts, Albert launched an initiative in 1853 to document every single work of art by the Renaissance master Raphael, building on the collection of prints inherited from George III and George IV. Like the Raphael collection, Albert's vision of Albertopolis was only realized after his death. The Royal College of Chemistry, founded in 1845 and patronized by Albert, merged with the Royal School of Mines in 1853 and moved to South Kensington in 1872 to form the core of Imperial College London. The Royal Albert Hall, the concert venue dedicated by Victoria to Albert's memory, was inaugurated in 1871. The Natural History Museum opened in 1881, and the Royal College of Music in 1883. Albert was one of Britain's great royal patrons of art and culture. In September 1852, during Victoria and Albert's annual visit to Balmoral, the couple received news of the Duke of Wellington's death. Albert organised the Duke's state funeral, a grand spectacle during which the late Duke's body was transported in a funeral carriage from the Royal Hospital in Chelsea to the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. The victory at Waterloo had brought Britain and Europe several decades of relative peace and tranquility, but Wellington recognised that the British Army needed reform at the dawn of an age of industrialised warfare. A few years earlier, the Duke had suggested that Albert should succeed him as Commander-in-Chief and lead the necessary reforms. Albert declined, and Wellington was succeeded by the uninspiring Lord Hardinge, an old soldier who had served under Wellington during the Napoleonic Wars and had been Governor-General of India a few years earlier. The restoration of the French Empire by Napoleon III prompted fears of renewed hostilities with France, England's perennial enemy. While the spectre of war was indeed on the horizon, British and French soldiers would fight side by side when it broke out. The spark for this was the outbreak of a fresh war between the Russian and Ottoman empires during their long-running rivalry in the Black Sea, Caucasus and Balkans. The Russian Black Sea Fleet sank an Ottoman squadron at Sinope on the northern coast of Turkey in November 1853. As the war developed, concerns grew in London and Paris that the Russians would seize Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, inflaming British opinion. While Albert believed Britain could secure its foreign policy objectives without going to war, the popular Palmerston, back in government as Home Secretary, demanded action. After formally joining the war against Russia in March 1854, in September nearly 60,000 British and French troops landed on the Crimean Peninsula and laid siege to the port of Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Meanwhile, Albert met with Napoleon III in France to consolidate the alliance between the former rivals. The Crimean War soon highlighted the inadequacies of both armies. Public opinion quickly turned against the war as war reporters and photographers documented the death, destruction, and incompetence of the Allied military leadership, exemplified by the infamous charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava. In January 1855, the Queen reluctantly acknowledged that only Palmerston could command a parliamentary majority as Prime Minister. After Sevastopol finally fell in September 1855, the new Russian Tsar Alexander II sued for peace, which was signed in March 1856. Although the British and French had temporarily prevented Russia's expansion into the Balkans, both sides suffered awful casualties. To recognise the courageous exploits of individual soldiers, in February 1856, Victoria instituted the Victoria Cross with the inscription, "For Valour." The performance of the respective armies in the Crimean War provided vital intelligence to the Prussians, who determined that Britain would be incapable of resisting a further armed attempt to resolve the Schleswig-Holstein question in their favour. While the war was ongoing, Victoria and Albert received Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia at Balmoral in 1855. The 23-year-old prince was the nephew of the childless Prussian king and would eventually succeed to the throne as Friedrich III. Victoria and Albert were determined that their eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, would marry the Prussian prince. Friedrich's visit in 1855 formalized their engagement, and the couple were married in January 1858. A few months before the wedding of her eldest daughter, Victoria gave birth to a daughter named Beatrice, the last of her 9 children. While the Queen's regular pregnancies indicated that the couple were passionately devoted to each other, the royal couple were also prone to frequent arguments, and Albert struggled to cope with Victoria's mood swings. In the royal household, Albert was an absolute monarch, even though he had no formal English title. Since their marriage, Victoria had repeatedly urged her ministers to grant her husband a title, but the Westminster politicians were wary of Albert's political ambitions and repeatedly refused the request. They were finally forced to act, as the couple's eldest son was approaching adulthood and would outrank his father on official occasions as Prince of Wales. In June 1857, the Privy Council finally agreed to grant Albert the title of Prince Consort rather than King Consort. The same year witnessed a major upheaval in India as Indian soldiers rebelled against British rule. Britain had hitherto exercised its authority in India through the East India Company, but after the Indian Mutiny, the British Crown took formal control of India. While Albert welcomed the centralisation of imperial power in London, he was increasingly concerned by the militaristic turn in Prussia. He hoped that his beloved daughter Vicky would strengthen the cause of liberalism in Berlin. His hopes would be dashed. Although Prince Friedrich shared his wife's liberal attitudes, he was incapable of standing up to his autocratic father, who became King of Prussia in 1861 and Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany in 1871. By the time Friedrich succeeded to the throne in 1888, he was dying and ruled for only a few months before his son Wilhelm II succeeded him. Albert bitterly regretted the departure of his favourite child, and in May 1858 he went to Germany to revisit Coburg and call on his daughter in Berlin. While Albert could find no fault with his eldest daughter, he was less impressed by his eldest son and namesake. Although Bertie was growing up to be a charming young man, he was a poor student and did not share his father's interest in history and art. In October 1859, Bertie began his university studies at Christ Church College, Oxford, but his academic performance failed to impress his parents. Aside from the Prince of Wales, Albert had plenty of other worries in 1859. Across the Atlantic, the United States was heading towards civil war, while in Asia, British soldiers were fighting alongside the French to expand their trading privileges with the declining Qing Empire in China in the Second Opium War. In Europe,
Napoleon III offered military support to the Italian nationalists in their struggle to push the Austrians out of northern Italy. The British public favoured the Italian cause, but Victoria and Albert remained neutral and doubted the viability of an independent Italian state. Meanwhile, Albert received regular updates on German affairs from his daughter Vicky in Berlin. The Queen and Prince Consort were planning another German match for their daughter Alice, this time with Prince Louis of Hesse-Darmstadt. After accompanying her parents to Germany in September 1860, Alice's engagement with Louis was formalized in April 1861. The marriage was a happy one, though Alice would die in her mid-30s, while her daughters Elizabeth and Alix would marry into the Russian Romanov dynasty and fall victim to the Bolsheviks many years later. Amidst political crises at home and abroad, Albert often suffered bouts of illness. By late 1860, he was suffering from shivering fits and vomiting, symptoms of Crohn's disease. Although he had a weak constitution since childhood, Albert worked hard throughout his life, spreading his energies across a wide range of issues and interests. While Albert was ill, Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, was diagnosed with cancer and died in March 1861. The Queen suffered a psychological collapse and often directed her angry outbursts at her husband. Meanwhile, Albert was preoccupied with many issues, including the continued uncertainty over Schleswig-Holstein and the prospects of the Prince of Wales, two issues which he hoped to address at a single stroke. In 1860, Albert had arranged for Bertie to visit North America, where the prince was greeted with unexpected enthusiasm by the American crowds. Albert was nevertheless disappointed by reports of his son dancing late into the night and flirting with actresses, and in 1861 he arranged for his transfer to Trinity College, Cambridge, where his academic performance improved under the supervision of Charles Kingsley, Regius Professor of Modern History. Albert also formed plans for Bertie to marry Princess Alexandra of Denmark. By connecting the British royal family with their Prussian and Danish counterparts through marriage, Albert believed that Prussia would avoid going to war with Denmark over Schleswig-Holstein. In September 1861, Bertie travelled to Germany, where his sister Vicky arranged for him to meet with Princess Alexandra. In November, Albert learned that days before meeting the Danish princess, Bertie had spent 3 nights with the actress Nellie Clifton while undergoing military training at the camp at the Curragh in Ireland. Albert was shattered by the revelations which brought to mind the scandals involving his father and his mistresses during his youth. This undermined the efforts he and Victoria had made over 2 decades to present the royal family as a respectable institution. Albert immediately wrote a lengthy letter chastising his son and travelled to Cambridge to talk to him 2 weeks later. While Bertie apologised for his behaviour and reconciled with his father, the visit worsened Albert's fragile health. By the start of December, Albert was unable to eat, although he mustered the energy to draft a message defusing the Trent affair, a diplomatic incident during the American Civil War where the US Navy stopped the British mail ship RMS Trent and took 2 Confederate envoys captive. On the morning of Sunday the 14th of December 1861, Prince Albert died at the age of 42, leaving behind the distraught Queen Victoria, who famously continued to wear black in mourning for her late husband throughout the remaining 40 years of her life. The Queen commissioned a royal mausoleum at nearby Frogmore for herself and Albert, which was richly decorated by Gruner, taking inspiration from Albert's Raphael collection. A more public memorial to Albert can be seen in Kensington Gardens across from the Royal Albert Hall. Commissioned by Victoria and designed by George Gilbert Scott, the Albert Memorial takes the form of an elaborate Gothic canopy surrounded by allegorical sculptural groups and friezes depicting musicians, poets, architects, painters and sculptors. The memorial was inaugurated in 1872, and the golden seated figure of Albert was placed underneath the canopy 3 years later in 1875. The statue overlooks one of his greatest legacies, the collection of cultural institutions in South Kensington financed by the Great Exhibition. Today, Albert is remembered as a figure who embodied the political and economic developments of the mid-19th century that laid the foundations for the largest empire the world has ever known. However, Albert himself had grander ambitions to play an active role in British political life, and his vision for peace in Europe crumbled after his death as Prussian armies forged the German Empire with blood and iron through 3 successful wars against Denmark, Austria and France between 1864 and 1871. Several decades later, the subjects of Albert's grandsons, Kaiser Wilhelm II and King George V, were facing each other across the blood-stained battlefields of the First World War. What do you think of Prince Albert? Does he deserve his reputation as a liberal reformer who patronised the arts and sciences and brought the British royal family into the modern age? Or was he too naive in seeking to forge European unity through dynastic alliances in an age of nationalism? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had 9 children before Albert's premature passing in 1861. Although his early death meant that he never met most of them, the couple eventually had 42 grandchildren and 87 great-grandchildren. The figure runs into the hundreds for subsequent generations of their descendants. The sheer size of the family they started was captured in The Family of Queen Victoria, a huge painting that was produced by the Danish painter Laurits Tuxen in 1887 to commemorate her Golden Jubilee that year. There are 53 people in the picture. Their children, grandchildren and other descendants would go on to rule Britain, Germany, Norway, Romania, Greece, Spain and several of the smaller German principalities, while they were related through marriage to almost every single European royal family. It is not an exaggeration to describe the couple as the grandmother and grandfather of Europe, and yet that was a difficult legacy too. It meant that the haemophilia that Victoria was a dormant carrier of spread around Europe's royal families, and that when the continent went to war in 1914, it pitched cousin against cousin. None of that can have been foreseen when a 20-year-old queen married a 20-year-old consort at the Chapel Royal on the 10th of February 1840. Their union was to shape Europe's royal politics for the next century.